All right, class, so this may be one of the most beneficial bits of instruction that you're going to get throughout your academic career, because what we're going to talk about in this instructional video is how to construct the academic speech outline. And if you remember at the start of the semester when I talked about what it takes to be a successful college student, you need to do two things well. Have to be able to follow directions and have to be able to write well. And part of being able to write well is to have a system in place for being able to efficiently and effectively crank out research papers or outlines for oral presentations. And I can also tell you this, as you navigate your way up the academic ladder, you'll find more and more emphasis on writing papers and doing oral presentations, less emphasis on taking tests. And what kind of happens once you get from community college, you get to that 4-year level, and then even if you go on, get a master's degree or a PhD, you start becoming more into the field that you're majoring in. And so a nice little shift takes place. Now it's more about what can you offer to the field instead of sitting in a classroom, taking in information, and then regurgitating back on an exam. So you really want to make sure by the time that you leave community college, you've got a system in place. So anytime you have a research paper or an oral presentation, and these are presentations that involve the use of research and evidence, you want a system in place that you can follow, kind of a recipe, if you will, or a step-by-step process that will get you through the whole constructing an essay with research, or in this case, we're going to learn how to do an outline with research, and we're going to do that by going through the steps of speech preparation. So if you take a look here on the board, I walk you through the 8 steps of speech preparation. And I always like leaving the first one blank because I think it's a really easy concept to grasp. It's one of the most important aspects of the speech preparation process, but it often goes overlooked when you're sitting down to write a paper or you're sitting down to write a speech. First thing you always want to begin with when you're writing a paper or writing a speech, audience analysis. Anytime you're going to give a presentation, very first thing you want to think about will be, who am I presenting this information to? Because that's going to affect the topic that you use. It will affect the language, the phrasing that you'll use. For example, if I'm preparing a presentation for a group of senior citizens, my language, my phrasing, my topics are probably going to be quite a bit different than if I was preparing a speech to a group of middle school kids. So you always want to consider the audience. And I even suggest this when it comes to writing papers. Know your professor. Pay attention in the class. See if you can catch some of the likes or the dislikes of the instructor. Then when you're writing that 50-page paper, when you get to your senior level, you're close to graduation, but you're in a class of 150 students, you turn in that paper, the instructor's reading through all of the papers and then gets to your paper. You've listened in class and you know that professor is a big Laker fan. You make a reference to the Lakers, something like that in one of your examples. You know what that professor's going to do? He's going to go, he's going to flip that around, look at the name again. Subjectively, you just earned yourself a couple extra points because you were able to relate to the person who is reading the paper. So even when you're writing research papers, always think about your professor. That's who you're writing the paper to. The more you can relate that information to the individual you're writing the paper for or you're speaking to, you're going to go a little bit further in terms of getting that person to buy whatever it is that you're selling. So audience analysis, always the starting point when it comes to public speaking, and specifics that you want to consider about your audience: age, gender, race, religion, ethnicity. If I'm giving a presentation and I'm trying to raise some funds, I'm also going to think about the jobs that the folks have, maybe the workforce that they're involved in. That kind of gives me a ballpark idea on how much money I want to go for as far as raising funds. So always think about the audience. It's always the starting point when it comes to public speaking. Then use that information about the audience and then you're going to select a topic for your speech, and that's the obvious one. Typically, if I walk into the class and I go, okay, class, today we're going to talk about the steps of speech preparation, usually the first thing they'll mention, oh, we have to come up with a topic. Just remember, think about the audience first and use that information to come up with a topic, because you always want your topics to be relevant and significant to the audience. The thing we learned about the outline format for the academic speech that we're using for this particular presentation, we added that significant step to the introduction, and that's where the audience analysis comes in. We want to make sure we can relate the topic of the speech to the audience that we're actually speaking to. Then we're going to go to research. We're going to organize that research into the body of the speech. It's in this section where I think I can save you a lot of time. Then we're going to write the body of the speech first, then do the intro and the conclusion. After we get done with our first draft, we're going to read it out loud. We're going to time it. Then we want to make any cuts or additions so we're within that 5 to 7 minute time range. And then the last thing you want to do in the steps of speech preparation is to think about visual aids, things you can show the audience that will help them to better comprehend the information that you're sharing. All right. So we've got audience analysis. We talked about topic selection in an earlier lecture. And just remember, good topics for speeches don't magically fall out of the sky. I always tell students, spend about 30 minutes or an hour to come up with a topic for a speech, because really the better your topic, the better the overall presentation. So always think of 3 criteria to use anytime you're selecting a topic for a speech. Obviously, you want to get a topic that resonates with you. This is a topic that I like. It could be, I know a lot about this topic, so I feel very comfortable speaking about it. Or especially in a college classroom setting, it might be that I don't know a lot about this topic, but it's something I want to learn about, so I'm going to select that as a topic. So always you want to have a high degree of interest in the topic that you're selecting. Number 2, you want to consider the audience and how the topic relates to the audience. And then number 3, before you select a topic, especially if it's a paper or speech that you're doing in the college classroom, I always suggest do a preliminary research search to make sure there's enough information available so you can have enough information to gather and put the speech together. What you don't want to have happen is you select a topic, then you start doing the research and you can't find any information. So I always like to do a preliminary research search on a list of topics to help me determine the best topic from a list. And I highly recommend that you begin the process of topic selection with brainstorming, like we talked about in an earlier lecture. Don't just try to think of the topic. Try to generate a list of 5, 10 possible topics, and then use that 3-point criteria that I just mentioned. Compare those topics to the topic that you would like the best, topic you think the audience would like the best, and which of these topics has the most information available. Those are the 3 guidelines to use when you're selecting a topic. Once you have your topic selected, now it's time to get to work. The very next thing that you want to do, you want to go gather research on the particular topic. And when you're doing college level research, make sure that you use an academic search engine. Look, Google's great to go to find a restaurant or to find out the movie times, but don't go to Google when you're doing college level research. And the reason why, you're not guaranteed that the hits you get if you do a search on Google, that it will be information that you can use, because the information is published. You know, the internet has been great for doing research, but it's also been problematic in the sense that you have more access to information, so you have to do a much better job of determining the valid information that you can use in an academic setting from the information that you wouldn't want to use in an academic setting. And essentially, when you're looking at research to use in your speeches, to use in your papers, to use in your college work, you want to make sure that the information is published. That's kind of the bright line or the threshold that really determines information that we can use in our work and information we should stay away from. We want to make sure that that information is published. And that still doesn't mean we can use the information, but if it's published, I'm going to know the title of the publication, I'm going to know the person who wrote the information, and most importantly, I will know the date that the information was published. And remember this when it comes to public speaking and you're doing research. Primacy is important. And so you want to make sure that your primacy is based on recency, i.e., the more recent the source of evidence, the stronger the source of evidence. Back when I was coaching speech and debate teams, we won a lot of debates simply because we had the more recent evidence and research to support our arguments. So remember that you always want to get the most recent sources possible. So a good search engine to use is EBSCOhost. It's an academic search engine. You can use it for free just by going to the Solana webpage. Go to the library webpage. You've got a bunch of search engines that you can use. EBSCO is one of the best. And the nice thing about EBSCOhost as a search engine, you can use that all the way through your academic careers, regardless of where you transfer. That college is going to be able to offer you the use of EBSCOhost for free to do your college level research. And if you're using EBSCOhost as a search engine, that will lead you to research that you know is going to be published. You'll be able to know the title of the publication. That's the publication that's responsible for the information, the name of the newspaper, name of the journal, name of the book, name of the news magazine. You want to make sure that you have the author so you know who said it and how recent the date is. So that's a real key when it comes to doing college level research. And I would say when you look at research in terms of speech preparation for this speech that you're working on now, the 5 to 7 minute academic speech where you're required to use a minimum of 4 sources, I would say your outcome result should be at least 5 different sources of evidence on the topic. If you can get closer to 8, 10 sources, that's even better when you start putting your speech together. So the outcome of step number 3 for this assignment, when you do your research, you want to make sure that you have a minimum of 5 sources of evidence to start plugging into your presentation. All right. The next step that we're going to go into, step number 4, involves, okay, I've got all of my research. Now, how do I get what I need from the research into the body of the speech? And remember, once you have your topic and your thesis statement, always begin any paper, any speech, always write the body of the speech first. Look, when you're giving a speech, basically you're going to do 3 things. In your introduction, you're going to tell the audience what it is you're going to talk about. In the body of the speech, you talk about it. In the conclusion, you summarize what you just talked about. And I know a lot of you have gone through this experience. I ran into this a lot when I was in college. You've got 3 hours to bust out a big 50-page research paper. You've got all your research. Now it's time to figure out what you need from the research to put into the actual paper. I bet if I went around the class, and I suspect most of you have written at least one research paper, that's a paper where you had to incorporate evidence into the flow of the actual paper. But I bet if I asked you, what was the process or the system that you used to get what you need from the research into the paper, you would probably give me a lot of different explanations. And I think this is where college students really lose a lot of time. And I notice this. I don't go over to the library as much as I used to, but back, especially before the internet, I'd cruise around in the library, maybe pick up the latest edition of Sports Illustrated. But I always noticed students in there that were coloring. Now, as students, you don't break out the box of 64 Crayolas. You've got those highlighter pens, right? Some of you, you've got those in your backpack right now. You got that little zipper. You got all the colors represented. I'm walking through the library and I see students, they're coloring. They think they're doing research, but they're just highlighting stuff, highlighting stuff, highlighting stuff. Folks, to me, that's a waste of time. We want to figure out how can we get to our research fast and efficiently, get what we need from the research organized into the body of the speech. Well, I'm going to have a seat right here and I'm going to show you. Step number 4, organizing your information from your research into the body of the speech. I'm going to grab a pen real quick over here. All right. So I'm at step number 4. I've got my research, and let's pretend my research is right here. So I have 5 different sources of research. I've copied that information out, and I'm kind of old school, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to write everything out. You can do the same process sitting in front of your computer or your laptop. Instead of actually printing out the research, you've just got a file on your desktop that has all of your articles, all of the things that you're using for research. They're ready to go. All right. So here's what I'm going to do first. And again, I'm old school. I like the legal pads. I'm going to have 3 legal pads. So you know for this speech in the body, you're going to have 3 main points. And one of the reasons why I want you to suggest your main points when you turn in your topic proposal, you want to have your main points identified by the time you start putting the body of the speech together, because that's going to really help you to organize your research. So essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my topic proposal. I'm going to look at my 3 main points. I'm going to put the title of main point 1 right here on this first legal pad, title of main point 2 on the second legal pad, title of main point 3 here on the third legal pad. Now, and I haven't read my research yet. All I've done is I've gone on EBSCOhost. I've read the abstract. That's the summary that gives me an idea of what's in the research. But all I've done is looked at the summaries, and I'm pretty sure this is information that I can use, but I haven't read through the research in detail yet. And the key to this system is I only want to read my research one time. I want to go through it one time, put it to the side, don't have to go back. I have everything I need from the research organized into the 3 main points. So I start reading through the research. Let's say that I'm doing an informative speech. Let's say I'm doing an informative speech on Bill Gates. In fact, that works because one of your sample outlines for the academic speech is on Bill Gates. And so let's say my main points, number 1, background. Like, where did he grow up? How did he get into computers? That whole thing. Then I might have a second main point that focuses just on the development of Microsoft. And then I might have a third main point that focuses on his foundations and his charities. So as I read through my research, anytime I find information that relates to one of those 3 main points, so maybe I'm reading through the research and I find a little section that tells me where Bill Gates was born, kind of how he first got into computers. Cool. That could go into my first main point. So when I find information in the research that I can use in one of my 3 main points, I'm going to take that information and I'm going to transfer it onto the corresponding sheet of paper. So here I've got, and you can do it with scratch paper. You could even have 3 blank documents up on the desktop. However you want to make it work, cool. So I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to take the information that I want to use in my speech. I'm going to transfer it onto the corresponding sheet of paper. But when I transfer that information, and this is so important when you're preparing an outline for a speech that ultimately you'll give without the use of notes, when I transfer that information, I'm going to write it out in my own words. Look, don't copy stuff word for word. And if you're citing the source, you could do that. It's just like a long quotation. But it's going to be harder for you to retain that information and then regurgitate it back to the audience. So to make it a little bit easier, translate that information. How would I share this? Put it into your own words and then write it on the corresponding sheet of paper. And then second, because I don't want to have to go back and go through my research a second time, I'm going to put the source citation, the information I need that tells me where I got the information, in the left-hand margin. So I find a bit in the research that I can use in the speech. I'm going to write it out on the corresponding pad of paper or sheet of paper that represents main point 1. And then in the left-hand margin next to that entry, I'm going to write 3 elements of the source. Title of the publication. That's the name of the book, the magazine, the academic journal. It's the name of the publication that I got the information from. Second, I'm going to write down the name of the author. And third, the name of the date. That's all I need. Title of publication, author, and date. So essentially, big picture, what I'm doing in step number 4, I'm reading through my research. Every time I find information from the research, I organize it onto the corresponding sheet of paper representing that main point. And when I transfer information, I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to write it out in my own words, and then I'm going to put the source citation in the left-hand margin next to the information. Ideally, I should be able to read through all of my research one time, set the research to the side. Now I have all the information that I need from the research organized into my 3 main points that I'll use in the body of the speech. Now, that's a perfect world. A lot of times you're going to hit things that kind of cause some disruptions. And a common one could be you're halfway through your research and you notice I've got a lot of info for main point 1, a lot of info for main point 2, but I ain't got jack on main point 2. So, do I go do more research? Not yet. Let's do this. You may find as you're reading through the research, you find information on a point that you didn't really consider. So the best way to fix that particular problem, instead of sticking with the main point, go get more research to fit the main point. See if you can adjust that main point to research that you're already finding. You can put enough information together. So instead of more research, just cross out the title, put in a new title for the main point, and continue on with the research. So ideally, when I'm done with step number 4, I have what I need from the research organized into my 3 main points. And realize too, this is a 5 to 7 minute speech. So when you break it down as far as time spent on each of your main points, you probably want a minute to a minute and a half of content in each of your 3 main points. Now, a lot of that information you'll just be able to generate off your knowledge of the particular topic that you're speaking about. So ideally, don't panic if you get done with all of your research and then maybe on your first pad, I only have half a page of information. Cool. That should be able to still work. So ideally, half a page from the research, that should be enough to get you at least a minute, minute and a half of content in each of your main points. And then the last thing I want to say about step number 4, when I'm going through the research, when I'm done with this step, a little later in the step-by-step process, I'm going to put together my introduction and my conclusion. And those are pretty easy to write because you already know the information that goes into setting up the speech or summarizing the speech. But 2 things that I will need in my introduction that I'll have to create will be my attention getter. That's either the story that I'm going to use to begin the speech, hypothetical example, could be a couple rhetorical questions, statistic, or a quotation. So what I'm going to do is I'm reading through my research. When I'm going through step number 4, I'm going to take an extra sheet of paper, put it off to the side. I'm going to draw a line in the middle. On the top, I'm going to put possible attention getters because it could be, as I'm going through my research, I found a great quotation that I won't necessarily use in the body of the speech, but it could be a good way to begin the speech. And I'm going to write this quotation here. Or it could be that I find, let's say I'm doing a behavioral persuasive speech. And so a good way to begin that speech is with the story of someone who's hurt by the problem that I'm focusing on in my presentation. Maybe I find a story of an individual. And so instead of putting it in the body of the speech, I'm going to use that as my attention getter. I'll write it here on the attention getting half of this sheet of paper. And then the second thing I'm looking for, remember, first, source citation. The first time you introduce evidence in the speech will be in the significance step that's right in the middle of the intro. And usually that's a statistic that talks about how popular, how widespread the topic is. And so I'm looking for that topic, I'm looking for that evidence to establish the significance of the topic. When I'm going through my research, I may find a source that works really well for establishing the significance. So instead of putting it in the body, I'm going to write it on the second half of the sheet of paper as possible sources to use to establish the significance. That way, once I'm done with my research, then I write the body of the speech, then I go to write the intro and the conclusion. I don't have a stop in the process because now I have to take some time and think about an attention getter. I can go right into the intro. I choose one of several attention getters. I also have the source that I'll need in the introduction to establish the significance of the speech. And so this is a really good, fast, efficient process because you're not going to waste time reading and rereading the research and then coloring and highlighting. You don't need to do all that. Get your research, read it, take what you need, and organize it into the 3 main points. Put your research to the side. Also make sure you're looking for possible attention getters source to establish the significance. If you do that, you can take the weekend that it usually took to crank out a paper. Now you can do it in 3 to 4 hours. And if you think about that throughout your whole academic career, a good system in place for figuring out how to get the research into the body of the speech is going to save you hundreds of hours of time over the future of your academic career. All right. And so, just to finish off, once I have my research organized into the body of the speech, the real heavy lifting is over. So now, next thing I'm going to do, step number 5, this is where I actually start working on the outline. Now, I'm going to take my 3 pads of paper. Now I'm sitting down on the computer or the laptop, and I take my information on the first main point, and I start plugging that into the outline, and I'm following that rule just like you did with the critic speech. As I'm plugging information in, I'm going to follow that rule, 1 sentence per subpoint. So essentially, when I start creating my outline, I'm going to start with Roman numeral 2, body, big A, and that's where I put in the title of my first main point. Now I'm going to take the pad with my research and realize too, I'm adding my own comments into the speech, and I just start plugging my content in, following that rule, 1 sentence per subpoint. And then maybe I get a section and I want to break that down a little bit further. That's where I can add the little A's, the little B's, and the little C's. And just remember, and I know it's annoying, anytime you use an A, it must be followed by a B. Anytime you use a 1, must be followed by a 2. We don't want dangling subpoints. And then when you're done with college and you're just making outlines for a speech that you're going to give, you don't have to turn it in. You can put Mickey Mouse ears on the outline, doesn't matter. But while you're in college, we want to make sure that we're doing our outline correctly. And as I plug information into that first main point, realize I need to have a minimum of 1 source citation in each of my main points. So that's where I figure out, okay, where do I plug my source in the speech? And when you put a source citation in an outline and in a speech, you always begin the sentence by giving us the source citation first, then give us the information that follows from the actual source. So that means I'm going to have 1 point that begins with, and according to title of publication, author, date, then I give the information from the actual source. So make sure you have at least 1 source citation plugged in to each of your 3 main points. And then for main points 1 and 2, once you get all your information plugged in, remember to add that final point, your transition sentence. And remember, transition sentence always does 2 things. Tells us the title of the main point that we're leaving and tells us the title of the main point that we're going into. If we're doing that speech on Bill Gates, in fact, if you look at the sample outline, you're going to see at the end of the first main point that transition sentence, and it'll go something like, now that we have a better understanding of the background and history of Bill Gates, let's next focus on Microsoft, right? So I've got my nice clean transition. All right. Once I have the body of the speech done, now I'm going to write my intro and conclusion, and I'm going to write that together because really all you're doing is changing the tenses. And it goes a lot faster when I begin that introduction if I can go right to my attention getting sheet and plug those attention getters in. Once I get done with the intro and the conclusion, very next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to time the speech. If it's too long, if it's over 7 minutes, I'm going to do a second draft and I'm going to cut it. If it's too short, I'm going to do a second draft and I'm going to add to the speech. And then the last step when it comes to speech preparation, and this is probably more prevalent if you're doing an informative speech rather than a persuasive speech, but once your speech is prepared, it's written. Now, read through the speech out loud and ask yourself this question. Are there any are there any parts of the speech or sections where if I show the audience something, they'll be able to comprehend the information more easily then that would indicate the use of a visual aid. Typically, we're going to use more visual aids in informative speaking because we're teaching the audience. And so visual aids and informative speeches tend to go together more than seeing visual aids in a persuasive speech. Any questions? Hit me up, gpaul@solano.edu. And before we end today, let's make sure we're still staying safe. We're following all of the rules that we should be, and really make sure we're keeping our distance from others so we can get this virus under control. Be well, stay healthy. I'll be back with another instructional video on the next assignment, which will be that final presentation you'll do at the end of the semester.